It was cold outside, and the wind was strong as Tom walked down the street with his little daughter, Lily, holding his hand tightly and tried to keep up with his big steps. The sky was gray, and heavy rain had fallen earlier, so the ground was wet, and their shoes made soft splashes with every step. Tom looked tired, but his face stayed calm for Lily, who skipped beside him wearing a small pink coat and a birthday badge that said 6 in shiny letters. She smiled even though her shoes were wet and her socks cold, because she knew something special was about to happen. Tom looked down at her and smiled back even though his heart felt heavy. He worked all week just to save a little money for this one evening, and it was all for her. It was her birthday, and he wanted to give her something she would remember. They stopped in front of a tall building with big glass windows and bright lights shining from inside. It was the nicest restaurant in the area, and Tom had walked past it many times, but never gone inside. Tonight was different. He looked at Lily and asked if she was ready, and she nodded fast with bright eyes. They pushed open the big glass door and stepped inside together. Warm air touched their cold faces, and they felt it right away. The room was full of people sitting at fancy tables with white cloth and shiny plates, and soft music playing in the background. A waiter looked up from across the room and stared at them for a moment before walking toward them slowly. Tom stood straight and spoke politely, asking if they could please have a table for two, because it was his daughter's birthday and they were excited to eat something nice. Lily held his hand and smiled at the waiter, her eyes shining with hope. The waiter looked at their clothes, which were clean but simple and still damp from the rain outside. He didn't smile back. He looked them up and down, and then, without saying a word, turned and walked away toward the back of the restaurant. Tom waited and glanced around the room, feeling the stares from the other guests who wore fancy jackets and dresses and had food already on their tables. Lily whispered that the room looked like a palace, and Tom nodded and said yes it did, and tonight they would eat like royalty. He tried to keep his voice light, but inside he felt nervous. Another waiter came over, this one older, with a serious face and a sharp black vest. He didn't greet them either. He asked in a cold voice if they had a reservation. Tom said no, but he explained again it was his daughter's birthday, and he had been saving for this special night, and he would pay in full. The waiter looked at Lily, then back at Tom, and raised one eyebrow in doubt. He told Tom the restaurant was very busy, and they didn't have space for walk-ins tonight. Tom looked around and pointed at 2 empty tables near the window, but the waiter said those were reserved. Lily's smile started to fade. Tom saw it, and his heart sank. He said again that they wouldn't stay long, just one meal, just a small celebration for his daughter. Still the waiter said no, and this time he added that maybe they should try somewhere else more suited for their situation. Tom didn't understand at first, but then he saw the look in the man's eyes, and it hit him. He was being judged not by his words, but by his clothes, by his face. By the way, he looked like someone who didn't belong here. Lily looked up at her dad with big eyes and asked if they could still have cake. Tom bent down and said, "Yes, sweetie, of course we will." The manager came out next, wearing a suit and a tight smile. He told Tom it was policy to refuse guests without a reservation, and then added quietly that some guests had complained about a disturbance at the door. Tom stood still, holding Lily close, and said they weren't making a scene, they just wanted a birthday meal. The manager didn't respond and simply gestured toward the door. People in the room were now watching openly, some with curiosity, others with smirks on their faces. One man near the back whispered something and laughed. Tom felt his face get warm, his hands shake, but he didn't want Lily to see. He looked down at her and said, "Come on, honey, let's go." She nodded and took his hand again, quietly, as they turned toward the door. The night felt colder now as they stepped outside again into the street. The rain had stopped, but the sky was still dark and the streets still wet. Tom stood still for a moment, thinking, trying not to cry. He looked down at his daughter, who looked up and asked if they could still find cake somewhere else. Tom nodded and said, yes, we'll find a place that wants us there. Then the restaurant door opened again behind them, and heavy footsteps came from inside. Tom turned around slowly, not knowing what was about to happen. Tom turned slowly as the restaurant door opened again, and the same sharp-faced waiter stepped outside with a forced smile on his lips and a strange look in his eyes. He walked straight toward them, holding something in his hand, and said in a loud voice, "So you dropped this." But there was nothing in his hand, just a napkin folded in half. Tom looked confused and said, "No, that's not mine," but the waiter didn't stop. He stepped closer and whispered low enough so no one else could hear, "Maybe take your daughter somewhere more your kind won't get stares." Tom didn't say anything. He just nodded slowly and pulled Lily close, trying to keep her from hearing those words, but it was too late. Lily looked up and asked softly, "Daddy, why doesn't anyone want us to stay?" Tom crouched beside her and brushed her hair back with a shaking hand, his voice soft and careful, saying, "Sometimes people don't understand us, but that's okay, because we know the truth." She nodded with her big sad eyes and held his hand even tighter. Tom stood up ready to walk away again when someone behind the glass window inside the restaurant tapped loudly and pointed at them, then laughed, as if they were part of some joke. A few other guests turned their heads and joined in with small smiles, as if they were enjoying a show and not a moment of real pain. Tom felt the sting in his chest, but he didn't want to let anger show. So he turned back toward the street when the restaurant manager came out next, wearing that same tight smile he had before. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you not to linger here. We have guests inside, and it's making them uncomfortable," he said, as if Tom and Lily were causing some kind of scene. Tom blinked in disbelief and said quietly, "We're just leaving. We didn't mean any harm." And the manager said, "That's good, thank you for understanding," then turned and walked back inside without another word. Tom looked down at Lily again and saw her lower lip tremble. But she didn't cry. She was trying to be brave for him the same way he was trying to be brave for her. He took her hand again, and they started to walk down the street with the lights of the restaurant behind them, fading slowly into the night. They passed a small bakery, but it was already closed, the chairs stacked up and lights turned off. Lily asked, "Daddy, can we just get a cupcake from anywhere? I don't need a big birthday cake." And Tom smiled gently at her, even though it hurt, and said, "Of course we can find something." They kept walking, and Tom tried to think of what to do next, maybe a small diner or a grocery store with a little cake in the fridge, something, anything, to make the night feel special again. As they turned the corner, a loud voice called out behind them, "Wait, sir, please wait." Tom turned around, confused and surprised to see a young woman running up to them from the restaurant. She wore a black apron and name tag that said Anna, and her cheeks were red from rushing out. She said, "I'm really sorry for what happened inside. I saw everything, and I wanted to say that not all of us are like them." Tom looked at her, unsure of what to say, but nodded slowly and said, "Thank you." Anna reached into her apron and pulled out a small paper bag and handed it to Lily. It was warm and smelled like sweet bread. Inside was a fresh muffin with chocolate chips and a small pink candle stuck in the top. Lily's face lit up, and she looked at the muffin as if it were made of gold, then looked up at the woman and said, "Thank you so much." Anna smiled and said, "Happy birthday, sweetie," then turned to Tom and whispered quietly, "I know what it's like to grow up with not much. My dad was just like you." Tom's throat felt tight, and all he could do was whisper "thank you" back as he held Lily's hand tighter. Anna nodded, then ran back toward the restaurant before anyone could see her outside too long. Tom and Lily walked to a nearby bench under a street lamp and sat down with the little muffin between them, and Tom pulled a lighter from his pocket, lit the candle, and sang "Happy Birthday" softly as people passed by without stopping. Lily closed her eyes and made a wish, then blew out the candle as Tom clapped for her, just the two of them in the quiet of the street with the sounds of the city behind them. Tom looked up at the stars just peeking through the clouds and wondered if this was enough, if this tiny moment could erase the pain of what had just happened. Then he heard something loud behind them, footsteps heavy and strong moving fast in their direction, and a deep voice calling, "Wait, don't go." Tom stood up quickly, holding Lily close, unsure of what was about to happen next. Tom turned quickly toward the voice's body, tense his arms wrapping around Lily as the heavy footsteps came closer, and the deep voice called again, "Wait, please don't go yet." From the shadows of the street, a tall man stepped into the glow of the streetlight, wearing a long black coat and shiny leather shoes, his steps slow and steady like someone who was never in a rush. Tom narrowed his eyes, unsure of what this man wanted, but stayed still while holding Lily close. The man had sharp eyes and silver in his hair, but something about him was calm and confident, like he was used to walking into any room and being noticed. Lily looked up at him without fear, just curiosity, as she clutched the little muffin in her hands. The man stopped a few feet away and gave a small nod before speaking again. "I saw what happened back there," he said in a voice deep but gentle. "I saw the whole thing." Tom didn't answer right away, his mind spinning, wondering if this man was from the restaurant or someone sent to cause more trouble. But then the man said something strange, something that made Tom freeze. He said, "They treated you the same way they once treated me." Tom blinked confused and asked quietly, "Do I know you?" The man smiled just a little and shook his head. "No, but I know you, or at least I know what you're going through." He took another step forward and looked down at Lily, then back at Tom, and said, "I was just like you once, cold, tired, trying to give someone I love a reason to smile." Tom didn't know what to say. He felt unsure if this man was serious or just another stranger playing a game, but there was no threat in his eyes, only something that looked like memory and pain. The man looked back at the restaurant, and his smile faded. He said, "That place used to turn me away, too. They said I didn't belong. They laughed when I tried to sit at their tables. Now they chase me for reservations." Tom still didn't understand who this man was, but something told him to listen. Lily looked up again and asked softly, "Are you a nice person?" The man chuckled and crouched down to her level. He said, "I try to be, and today I want to do something good, because once someone did something good for me." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small black card with gold writing and handed it to Tom. Tom turned it over and saw the name Mr. Grant on the front with a company name he didn't recognize and a phone number below. Mr. Grant stood back up and said, "Come with me back to the restaurant. You and your daughter are going to have that dinner tonight." Tom's heart beat faster. He said, "We can't go back in there. They already said no. They don't want people like us inside." Mr. Grant looked toward the bright restaurant windows and said, "Then maybe they need to learn who gets to decide who belongs." He pulled out his phone and tapped the screen once, then looked at Tom again and said, "Trust me, I'll handle it." Before Tom could answer, Mr. Grant was already walking toward the restaurant with long, steady steps, his coat moving behind him like a cape and his presence pulling attention like a magnet. Tom hesitated, but Lily tugged his hand and whispered, "Daddy, let's go. He looks like a superhero." Tom almost laughed, but nodded, and together they followed behind the stranger who walked like he owned the street. When they reached the restaurant doors, the host opened it without even asking and stared wide-eyed at Mr. Grant. The manager appeared quickly, his smile nervous and thin like a crack in glass. Mr. Grant didn't stop walking. He looked the manager in the eye and said, "I'll be dining with my guests tonight. Set the best table." The manager stammered, "Sir, there may be a mistake. We don't usually allow." And before he could finish, Mr. Grant raised a hand and said, "Then tonight is different." Tom stepped inside, holding Lily's hand, and looked around at the same faces that had stared at them before, now frozen with surprise and confusion. A waiter rushed over this time with politeness and led them to a large corner table by the window where the lights were soft and the chairs were cushioned like thrones. Mr. Grant sat with them and said, "Order anything you want. It's on me tonight." And when Tom began to protest, he raised his hand again and said, "Please let me do this." Lily opened the menu wide, her eyes glowing, and whispered to her dad, "This is the best birthday ever." Tom smiled and nodded, but his hands were still shaking, not from fear anymore, but from something new, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. He looked across the table at Mr. Grant and asked quietly, "Why are you doing this?" Mr. Grant looked out the window, then back at them, and said, "Because someone once did the same for me, and it changed my life." Tom sat at the soft chair feeling like he was floating, not sure if this was real or just a strange dream. The restaurant no longer felt cold or judging. The lights seemed warmer, the music softer, the air easier to breathe. Lily looked around with wonder, her eyes wide as she turned the big menu page by page, pointing at dishes she had never seen before. Mr. Grant sat across from them, calm and steady like he had done this 1,000 times, yet still looked at them like they mattered, like he was happy to be there. A waiter came over quickly, this time smiling and polite, and asked if they were ready to order. Tom looked unsure and said, "I don't even know what half of this is," and Mr. Grant leaned forward and said, "Just pick what sounds fun. I promise it will be good." Lily giggled and said, "I want the thing with the little noodles and the cheese bubbles and the chocolate lava cake, please." The waiter smiled and nodded, and Tom added, "Just a simple steak for me, if that's all right," and Mr. Grant said, "Bring him the best one you have, and don't hold back." The waiter rushed off like this was the most important table in the world, and for the first time in a long time Tom felt like he was being treated like a human being with worth. Lily leaned across the table and whispered, "Daddy, is this what rich people eat every day?" And Tom smiled and said, "Maybe, but tonight we're eating like royalty." Mr. Grant smiled too and said, "She's smart and brave and polite. You've done a good job raising her." Tom looked down for a second and said, "Thank you, I try, but it's not easy." Mr. Grant nodded slowly and looked out the window, then said, "Nothing worth doing is ever easy, but you're doing it, and that matters more than you think." Their food came out fast and perfect. The steak was soft and juicy and melted in Tom's mouth like butter, and the little cheesy noodles made Lily laugh every time the bubbles popped. She looked like she was glowing. Happiness poured out of her with every bite, every giggle, every moment of this strange, magical dinner. Tom ate slowly, almost afraid the moment would vanish if he moved too fast. He watched the people around them too, and noticed how the same guests who had stared earlier were now silent, some looking curious, some pretending not to look at all. Mr. Grant cut his food slowly and said, "I remember a night just like this when I was younger, hungry, cold, and lost, and someone took me and gave me a seat, gave me food, gave me hope." Tom listened closely, not wanting to miss a word. Mr. Grant said, "I had nothing. I wore second-hand shoes and a jacket too small for me. I walked into a place like this and got turned away. They said I was dirty and poor. They said I didn't belong." Tom nodded because he understood every word of that feeling. Mr. Grant continued, "But one man, a stranger, stood up for me. He told them I was his guest. He paid for my meal and never gave his name. I never saw him again, but that moment stayed with me forever." Lily listened to her eyes wide as she slowly ate the last bite of her pasta. Mr. Grant smiled and said, "I promised myself that night if I ever had enough I would do the same for someone else. And tonight I saw you and I remembered." Tom looked at him and said, "I don't know how to thank you." And Mr. Grant said, "Just enjoy the night and keep doing what you're doing. Your daughter is lucky to have you." The chocolate cake came out last, warm and rich, with a scoop of vanilla on the side, and Lily clapped her hands as the waiter placed it in front of her. She took a bite and closed her eyes and whispered, "This tastes like happiness," and everyone at the table laughed. Tom felt tears behind his eyes, but blinked them away. He didn't want to cry, not here, not now, but inside his heart was full. He had come in out of the cold, rejected, and pushed aside, and now here he was sharing a meal with a stranger who had become something more. Someone who saw him. Someone who remembered what it was like. The manager came over nervously and asked if everything was all right, and Mr. Grant looked at him and said, "Yes, everything is perfect, and next time treat every guest like this, or I won't be back." The manager nodded quickly and walked away as fast as he could. Tom leaned back in his chair and took a deep breath. For the first time in days, he felt safe. He felt like maybe things could still turn around. Lily leaned her head on his arm and whispered, "This is the best birthday ever," and Tom kissed the top of her head and said, "I'm glad, sweetie, you deserve it." Mr. Grant looked at them both and smiled, then reached into his coat and pulled out a second card, sliding it across the table toward Tom, and said, "When you're ready, come see me. I have something more for you." Tom picked it up slowly, not sure what it meant, but somehow knowing deep inside that his life had just changed forever. Tom held the card in his hand and stared at it. The gold letters seemed to shine brighter now, almost like they were calling to him, but he didn't know why. He looked up at Mr. Grant, who was now leaning back in his chair, his eyes calm, but full of something deeper, something heavy like a memory that never left. Lily had finished her chocolate cake and was now humming softly, resting her head on her dad's arm, sleepy and full and happy in a way that made Tom's heart ache with quiet joy. Tom looked at Mr. Grant and asked, "What do you mean when you say you were just like me? How did you become who you are now?" Mr. Grant looked out the window for a moment, then turned back and said it wasn't luck, it was pain. Tom stayed quiet and listened closely. Mr. Grant began to speak in a soft voice, the kind that doesn't want attention, but still carries power. He said, "I grew up in a small, broken home. My dad left. When I was 7, my mom worked in a laundry shop from morning to night. We had nothing but each other and old blankets in winter. I sold newspapers. When I was 10, clean shoes when I was 12, and by 15 I was working in a garage full-time and go to school when I could. People didn't see me. They saw dirt on my hands and holes in my shoes. They thought I was nothing, and some days I believed them." Tom nodded because he knew that feeling too well. Mr. Grant continued, I remember one night I walked into a diner, just like this one, hungry, tired, hoping to get something small to eat, with a few coins I had saved, and they laughed at me, the staff, the guests, even the owner. They told me to get out, said I smelled bad, said I didn't belong in a place like that. I walked back outside and sat on the curb and thought maybe that's all my life would ever be. But then something happened, something small but powerful. A man I had never seen before came out of the diner and sat beside me. He gave me a sandwich and a warm drink and didn't say much at first. Then he looked at me and said, the world sees what's on the outside, but don't ever forget who you are on the inside. Tom felt a shiver go through him as those words landed deep in his chest. Mr. Grant said that one night gave me a little light, just enough to keep going. I kept working, I kept learning, I saved every penny I could, and I got one chance years later when someone gave me a job no one else would. I took that chance and gave it everything I had, and over time things started to change slowly but surely. Now I run my own company, and people see the suits, the money, the cars, but they don't see the boy who sat alone on a sidewalk with nothing but hope in his pocket. Tom looked down at Lily, who was now fast asleep, her face peaceful, and her little hands curled around the edge of her jacket. He looked back at Mr. Grant and said, thank you for telling me that it means more than I can say. Mr. Grant leaned forward again and said, I see that fire in your eyes, that same quiet fight I once had, and I know how hard it is to hold on when no one believes in you. But I do. Tom swallowed hard and felt his chest tighten, not from pain, but from something close to gratitude mixed with disbelief. Why me, he asked quietly, why tonight? Mr. Grant looked at him and said, because I was walking by that restaurant earlier. I was meeting someone else across the street, but I looked through the window and saw what was happening, and I couldn't walk away. I saw your face, I saw your daughter's face, and I saw the way they looked at you, like you were invisible, like you were small. But you weren't small. You were strong for her, and you were proud even when they tried to make you feel ashamed, and that kind of strength deserves to be seen. Tom couldn't find the words. He felt something build inside him like a storm of tears that he kept back, not because he didn't feel, but because he felt too much. Mr. Grant reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper and handed it to Tom. It was a letter with his company name at the top and something written inside that looked like an offer. This is for you, Mr. Grant, said softly, a job with training, housing support, and everything you need to start fresh. Tom stared at the paper, not believing what he was holding, and said, I don't have the right education or background. I've been just surviving for so long. Mr. Grant said, that's enough for now. The rest can come later. I'm not offering this out of pity. I'm offering it because I believe in people who keep going even when everything says stop. Tom nodded slowly, his hands still shaking as he held the paper. He looked at Mr. Grant and whispered, thank you not just for this, but for seeing me. Mr. Grant smiled and said, someone once saw me too, and it changed everything. Now it's your turn. Tom held the letter in his hands for a long time, staring at the words, reading them again and again, as if they might disappear if he blinked. Outside the restaurant, the city lights glowed softly, the street buzzed with passing cars and quiet voices, but inside the world felt still, like this moment had been waiting for him his whole life. Mr. Grant stood up from the table and buttoned his coat slowly, then looked down at Lily, who was still asleep in her chair, her tiny arms wrapped around herself, her head resting on her dad's shoulder. He smiled gently and said, she's strong, just like you. Don't let the world make you forget that. Tom looked up and said, I don't even know what to say. This feels like something out of a movie. Mr. Grant laughed a little and said, maybe it does, but it's real, and now it's yours. He placed a small envelope on the table and said, this is for the next few days. Take care of her, get some rest, buy what you need, and then come see me Monday morning. We'll talk about the job and the future. Tom nodded slowly, still in shock. His fingers touched the envelope and felt how thick it was, but he didn't open it yet. He just held it carefully, like it was something sacred. Mr. Grant turned to leave, and Tom stood up quickly, not wanting to let him go without saying more. Thank you, sir. Thank you for seeing me, for helping us, for treating me like a person again. Mr. Grant turned back with a warm look in his eyes and said, don't thank me yet. Just prove to yourself that you're ready to begin again, because I think you are, and so does she. He nodded toward Lily and then walked out of the restaurant without another word, disappearing into the night like he had been sent just for this one purpose. Tom sat back down slowly and watched the door for a long moment then looked at his daughter, who was still dreaming peaceful and safe and beautiful. He touched her hair gently and whispered, "We're going to be okay now, I promise." The waiter came back with a quiet voice and asked if they needed anything else, but Tom shook his head and said, "No, we're good, we've had everything we needed and more." He lifted Lily carefully into his arms and carried her out of the restaurant into the cool night air, her head resting on his shoulder, her soft breathing steady and light. As they walked down the street, Tom looked up at the sky stars finally peeking through the clouds, like they had been waiting to shine for this one night. He thought about the past, the long hours, the missed meals, the silent tears, the days he wanted to give up but didn't. And now all of that led to this moment, a night that started with rejection and ended with hope. He reached the small apartment where they lived and laid Lily on the bed, tucking her in and watching her for a long time, feeling something in his chest he hadn't felt in years. Peace. He opened the envelope slowly and found several crisp bills folded neatly along with a small handwritten note. It said, "Take care of her and take care of yourself. We believe in you." No name, no signature, just those words. Tom sat on the edge of the bed, holding the note, his eyes wet and his heart full. He looked around the room, which had always felt too small, too cold, too empty, and now somehow it felt warm, filled with something new, something invisible, but strong. The next morning, Lily woke up smiling and asked, "Daddy, was that all a dream?" Tom smiled back and said, "No, sweetie, it was real, and it's only the beginning." They spent the weekend buying new clothes, cleaning their little home, and even going to the park for the first time in months. Tom felt something shift in the way people looked at him, in the way he walked, in the way he carried himself, not because of money or a job offer, but because someone had reminded him of his worth. Monday came and Tom stood in front of a tall office building, holding Lily's hand and wearing his best shirt, clean and pressed. She looked up at him and said, "You look like a boss today," and he laughed and said, "Maybe one day I will be." They stepped inside and took the elevator to the top floor, where a woman at the desk smiled and said, "Mr. Grant is expecting you." Tom took a deep breath and nodded, and Lily squeezed his hand as they walked forward together into a room filled with light. And in that moment, Tom knew the past didn't define him, the future wasn't something to fear anymore, and everything that had once felt impossible was now within reach. Because one act of kindness had opened a door, and behind that door was a new beginning.